I have seen the Scream franchise more times than I could possibly count. I can recite the scripts, the musical cues, and all the rest. It's that much of a dedication. It occurred to me that whilst I have seen these movies so many times, I've never actually ranked them from my favourite to least favourite. I know which is my favourite and which is my least, but everything else in between constantly changes with each watch. So today, what I'm going to do is this. I am going to give you guys specifically a full ranking of every Scream film from my favourite to least favourite. I'll be talking about things like how enjoyable they are for me, how well they are made as a cinematic experience, the death scenes, the killers, and what they add to the franchise as a whole, as that is pretty important to me personally. Remember, these are just my opinions, and if you don't agree, that is absolutely fine. I'd love to hear your rankings below to see how they compare. Also, as stated, my rankings change with each rewatch, so what might be going on right now may change quite a bit in a couple of months. Nothing is set in stone, so without further ado, let's dive straight in. The first we had is Scream 1996. This is the movie that started it all. It was fresh, it transformed what was a dying genre in Hollywood into something that felt different and scary. It introduced us to the world of Scream, the mystery behind it, and it brought us characters like Sidney Prescott, Billy Loomis, Gale Weathers, and Stu Macher, and even the iconic Ghostface mask into mainstream media. As the introduction, it set the bar for the films that followed, as we ended up with killers like Billy Loomis and Stu Macher, and they became the blueprint for Scream killers, not to mention quotes like, "What's your favourite scary movie?" and "It's a Scream, baby." It was, spoiler alert, the best film in the franchise in my opinion, as the killers felt believable. The setup was fresh and it wasn't as self-aware as Scream became later on. The cinematography felt expansive in this film, that wasn't really there in films that followed. The big open shots of the mountains, Woodsboro itself, and all the rest really added to the realism of the film. There wasn't a whole lot of deaths in this one, but the deaths that did happen seemed to matter more, except maybe Principal Himbry. But most of the deaths here are remembered today by horror fanatics. Deaths like Drew Barrymore's opening scene, Tatum's garage incident, and so on. My ranking for this film falls in the A category. It's the film that introduced me to Scream before it became the global phenomenon that it is today. Okay, next up, we have Scream 2. It brought us back to the world of Scream in dramatic fashion, introducing us to a copycat killer that had the intentions of rehashing the same formula from the first film. The film pushed the meta aspect of Scream further with the inclusion of turning the in-universe events of Scream 1996 into a movie that was being watched by the new characters in Scream 2. It brought back the main cast like Sidney Prescott, Gale Weathers, and Dewey Riley, and introduced us to some newbies like Cece Cooper, played by Sarah Michelle Gellar, and a fleshed out Cotton Weary from the first film. The film was an enjoyable ride as it didn't feel repetitive despite the copycat killer aspect. What's more, we had tons of character development in this film. Characters like Gale, who lacked depth in the first movie, felt more fleshed out in this film, with her and Dewey's relationship kind of bringing out a vulnerability in her that we hadn't seen before. Not to mention Sidney having to face Cotton after she'd wrongly accused him for the offence of Scream 1. Cinematography was lacking here for the most part, but it made up for it in various sequences like the Cassandra production and so on. Mickey Altieri and Nancy Loomis made up a duo of fantastic but different killers. The death scenes were creative and took risks. The film is key in the franchise as, despite its display of a happy ending, we leave Sidney alone, and I mean she is literally alone, at the end with this feeling of, is this really over? Looming over as it pans away from her. I'm going to put Scream 2 beside Scream 1996. It's cliche, I know, but I do think these movies complement one another. They're both Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven's work, and I thought 2 was a fantastic ride. Scream 3 was next, and this was an interesting direction for the film, and it often gives me such a divisive tug of war. On one hand, this film had arguably the best writing for Sidney in the entire franchise, but on the other hand, the side stories and characters felt less impactful than what came before. characters like Angelina Tyler, Tyson Fox, and Tom Prince didn't feel as memorable with their screen time as characters like CC Cooper or even Hallie McDaniel. Scream 3 pushed meta even further with the inclusion of the stab-free cast. The film was about a killer murdering the cast of the latest Scream movies in universe. It was creative, and the mystery angle behind it was interesting, as the killer was forcing the viewers and the characters to revisit the origins of Maureen Prescott, Sidney's mum, who died before the events of 1996. The film rewrote history, with the Ghostface claiming to take responsibility for Maureen's death, even though Billy and Stu confessed to it in Scream 1. The death scenes were toned down in this film, so they felt less impactful here than they did in Scream 1 and 2. The house explosion, for example, felt ridiculous in comparison to what came before. And we were introduced to Roman Bridger as the only solo killer in the franchise, who happened to be Sidney's brother that she never knew existed. The film is key in the Scream story. As I said earlier, we had Sidney's strongest story to date here, with her facing her past and closing a long chapter on this torment that she'd faced over the past few years. The film has fluctuated from second favourite to further down the list over the years for different reasons, but today I rank this in the C tier. It's a great film, but it's not a perfect Scream film compared to 1 and 2. After a 10-year gap, Scream 4 followed with a fresh new generation to appeal to. Scream 4 is an interesting one. It felt like a return to form in many ways after Scream 3 was significantly toned down. The deaths in Scream 4 felt like they were ramped up to make up for what was lost in Scream 3. Sidney, Gale and Dewey were reunited, but all three were older this time, with Gale and Dewey being married in Woodsboro, and Sidney having moved on from her past and was now the author of her own book. Scream 4 introduced some great new characters like Jill Roberts, Kirby Reed, and even Rebecca Walters. The film formula felt updated for 2011, away from what was relevant in the 90s. The reveal gave us Jill Roberts and Charlie Walker as the killers, with Jill being one of the best in the franchise. Her self-mutilation scene makes me wince every single time I watch it. The issue with this film is that it's skippable in terms of what actually adds to the overall story. No one really goes through anything significant, and because most of the new characters die, it feels like it's just another bump in the road for the trio as opposed to a strong inclusion in the franchise. That being said, the deaths were solid. The film felt fresh and felt like a true reunion movie of sorts. Because of that, I had a great experience watching it in comparison to a lot of other films that followed. So my ranking for this film falls above 3 in the B category, but not quite on the standard of Scream 1 and 2. Next we have Scream 5. The film brought in a bunch of fresh new characters to softly reboot the franchise, but brought back the original trio to operate alongside the newbies as they faced off a new set of killers in the Ghostface costume. Fives was a cinematic improvement over the rest as technology had advanced quite significantly, so everything looks cleaner, shots felt more expansive, and the experience was enjoyable from that perspective, except from the sound studio version of Stu's house. It looked awful in comparison to what came before. The death scenes in this film were interesting. On one hand, it felt more brutal in terms of effects, but in the other, I don't think they really added anything new to the franchise that particularly wowed me in terms of death scenes. The killers themselves were okay, but continuing from Jill Roberts, there was a lot of room for improvement. They felt like remakes of Billy and Stu from the original, which was fine in theory, but in comparison, they weren't intimidating or threatening as the original killers. The story felt important for the trio though, as Dewey was killed in this movie, and that impact alone was felt in Sidney and Gale's arc in Scream 5. That being said, I still don't think this film felt the same in quality as the films that came before, despite cinematic improvements and the impact of Dewey's death. But because of the impact, I think I'd rank this in C alongside Scream 3. The death of Dewey felt important, just like Sidney's story in 3, but the overall movie experience wasn't as enjoyable as Scream 4. So finally we come to Scream 6, which is the latest entry from the franchise and went for a completely different vibe. This is the first film that didn't include Sidney but did bring back Gale Weathers. Scream 6 is a mixed bag. It introduced us to the tight unit that was the self-labeled Core 4 as they switched up the scenery to New York, where Sam and Tara from the fifth movie were followed by the killers. The Ghostface sequences were some of my favourites. I loved the train sequence. I thought they captured suspense perfectly with that feeling of unease, and the streets of New York felt menacing in a way that made you feel the survivors were being watched constantly. The death scenes were great, even if some of the film ventured into the unrealistic territory that Scream 3 did, with victims being stabbed and surviving with just a bandage over their wounds. Scream 6 does, however, suffer the same issues as Scream 4. It feels like a pointless entry at this point. The film doesn't progress or enhance anyone's story, and so it rotates dependency on the Ghostface sequences, but the actual writing and storytelling didn't feel as solid as what came before. The killers were pretty bland as well. Neither of these three felt like authentic murderers, which was a shame as it was the first Ghostface trio we've ever had on screen. Watching this in continuation with the past films feels jarring, but as a standalone film I think it could work. But overall I'd say this film falls below the rest in the D category. The change in scenery felt fresh, but the story, writing and lack of overall impact left little to be desired for me. But I don't hate it, I just don't love it either. Feel free to argue with me about this. I know so many of you have your own personal rankings, so please share them. I will be ranking more in the coming days as we count down the release of Scream 7, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of those rankings